Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Cookie Pocket. It's been a while for us. It hasn't been a while for you because we've been releasing regular content during our absence. But for us, we haven't recorded in like a little over a month, so it's a little weird getting back into the swing of things. But this will be our final film discussion of this season. And for our final film discussion of the season, we have a final guest of the season, a returning guest. Would you care to introduce yourself, sir?
Oh, sure. I'm Connor. I'm a buddy and regular collaborator of Zach's in the film world. And yes, second appearance on Cookie Pocket, and I'm looking forward to talking about Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, last season Connor was on the show when we talked about Black Sabbath, and he joined in with the rest of the group in royally roasting me. It was a dog pile of Tolkien-esque proportions if you want to tune into that episode last season. And today we're talking about quite a different film. We're talking about, like Connor mentioned, the 1978 Ralph Bakshi adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. Now, despite the fact that this is called The Lord of the Rings, it's an adaptation of the first and second novels, The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers, although now that I think of it, neither of the towers from The Two Towers appear in this film, which is a bit funny. But before we get too deep into the plot, let's talk about overall thoughts like we always do. What did you guys think of Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings?
It's hard to talk about this without talking about Peter Jackson's as a touch point. So I feel like it's important to say where I'm coming from here. I have read the books, but I read them in middle school, so that was a pretty long time ago. And I'm a pretty big fan of Peter Jackson's films. Even the Hobbit ones I'm kind of like okay with. So I had never seen Bakshi's. I feel like at some point Zach either like made a joke about how abrupt the ending was or sort of like hyped up how crazy it was to me. And I was looking forward to this. I definitely had a mixed experience. I was kind of sitting between a 3 and a 3.5 when I finished. And I landed on the 3.5 because I felt like giving bonus points for how different it was. There's not really an obvious touch point for me in terms of the style of the animation, visually what the rotoscoping looks like. Doesn't compare directly to like a Disney hand-drawn thing at all, I think. I think it's impressive how much ground they cover in these 2 hours. Like Zach said, they cover most of the first 2 novels, but it felt very stop-start to me at times in terms of how quickly we move through events and characters. Like we get the prologue very quickly. We get Bilbo leaving the Shire pretty quickly. It feels like we get a pretty decent chunk of time at Rivendell, but we don't get a lot of character moments with the members of the Fellowship other than like Aragorn and Frodo for most of the movie. So I don't know. I felt like I could kind of tell that the production was disorganized and unsure how much it would be able to do like during the movie, but I still enjoyed it. And because I'm coming from this sort of prior fandom for Lord of the Rings for the story, I could follow it, but I feel like others might have more difficulty following it had they not read the books or seen Peter Jackson's films. So 3.5, but maybe sort of like what Zach said for our Pinocchio episode, I think that score is more coming from a place of appreciation than from entertainment.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm coming from a little bit more of a position where I saw the Peter Jackson films when I was like in middle school. Tried to read the books, couldn't get through them. But I'm something of a Ralph Bakshi apologist. I don't know if that's the right term.
If you're going to mention Cool World, I swear to
I'm
God.
about to bring up Cool World. I don't think Cool World is as bad as everybody says it is. And so my thing is that like going into this film, I wanted to see a lot of what I enjoyed out of Cool World as far as the animation and art design and kind of like bombastic sensibilities to the art direction. And then I felt like this film was very sloppy. One of my problems was like, yeah, a lot of the animation is very interesting and it's super cool backdrops, but it's really hard to understand what's going on in a frame because of how the rotoscoping is working, and the mix of rotoscoping and traditional animation doesn't play super well together, and then you're left with a bunch of like disjointed frames within a single scene. And I think that builds into, a problem that runs throughout the whole film, which is the pacing, like you said, is very start and stop. And it's very much like we're just done with this scene. We're on to the next one with no real flow through the whole thing. And yeah, if I have to rate it out of 5, it's a 2. Which, like, I want to give it more points for creativity, but it is, one of those things where I think Bakshi does a better job of all of the cool stuff he does in this film in his other work. And it's not a particularly good adaptation of Lord of the Rings.
I didn't like the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings because it wasn't like Cool World, is I don't think something that anybody else has ever said. So we're covering new ground here on the show.
Yeah. I don't know who these people are. Yes, I did, Christian. I was there. We were all children. We all saw it. I was there. My mom played the Lord of the Rings games on the PS2.
Those were good.
I was inundated with Lord of the Rings from Christian and company and other people that were invested in it, and they're like, you should read this, and then like, no, I'm not reading that. I can barely read a regular book at length before I lose interest. I want my MTV Take On Me. These are my touch points for the film. I think I rarely, if ever, I cannot recall a single episode where I've said that the best thing I could say about a film was how charming it was, because I do feel like there was true passion and investment in the story and in the animation, and it was a true, honest attempt. And I feel like that's worth a lot more now that it's ever been, really. So maybe a little bit of time period bias there, but yeah, other than that, like I freaking forgot like most of what happened in the Peter Jackson films. I watched all of the Hobbit movies when they came out, but I still don't remember anything. So definitely a huge normie, and I think I was really trying to follow. I even had the closed captioning. I was like locked in. I was trying to understand everything. And there was way too many winks and nods for me to keep track. Like there was too many references for me to try to like decipher what was actually happening. Like I could see what was happening perfectly fine because every action scene and resting scene takes like 20 minutes. So it's like really easy to keep track of like who's dying and what's like what's happening. But when it in terms of what's happening within the plot, the start and stop thing, I totally agree. Like it's really hard to put this in any context. Even in the film's own context, like trying to keep the film as an audience member like in its own world and like trying to just take everything as it is, it's just impossible. Like I like within the first 20 minutes I was like, I'm missing so much right now and I have no idea what's going on. And now that it's crazy that I can say that and still not lose investment necessarily, just because like the way the characters like flail their arms and like over emote all the time, it's almost Shakespearean. It's like it reminds me of like plays. And it's like, even though I don't know what's going on, like the way they're singing or the way that they're fighting or like anything is just like super interesting to me. And that was like the only thing that was carrying me throughout the entire film, really. Like I really couldn't have given less of a shit about the ring and more about like when is Sam gonna have his breakthrough moment. that was pretty much what I was thinking. Yeah. So it was very interesting, super weird. Like it reminded me of like really weird like 70s fantasy movies that are just completely bizarre. I like don't remember the names of, but like it like Labyrinth or something. It's just like it's just absolute craziness, and the rotoscoping definitely emphasizes that like tenfold. Like it makes things 10 times worse in terms of how bizarre everything looks and janky sometimes. But I still gave it a 3 because it was I totally agree with you, Christian, and like there's clearly a certain level of respect that shows through the work. There's definitely an air of fantasy and atmosphere to it, and I will say the backdrops are very immersive. I really like the drawing of the backgrounds. It looks awesome. And sometimes the characters do look really great too, and the emotion does work. I won't completely crap on the rotoscoping, but yeah, it's just super bizarre, and I will need to read all the books and watch all the movies to fully understand. I already know. So
Yeah,
3 out of 5.
I think whether or not you enjoy this film kind of comes down to whether or not you find its attempts to adapt the story charming. Because I will admit, and I gave this a 3, I liked it a decent amount, but I will admit it's a huge mess. But I think I find its style and technique and what it's doing charming, even though a lot of it isn't executed that well. And I do think, Mitchell, you bring up a really good point of the characters and the performances. Because apparently during pre-production, they could never like decide if they wanted to do this as an animated movie or live action. And so eventually when they buckled down and decided to do it as an animated film, they had this weird like start stop halfway budget and schedule, and you have to plan things totally differently if you're going to do an animated versus live action film. And I do think you feel that in this, because the way they got the performances is there are different people doing the acting on set that is animated over than there are doing the voices. The people on set acted totally separately to the people who recorded their voices. Then animators have to draw over those people, and they have to vaguely attempt to sync up the animation over the performances to the voice. And in a lot of places, it just doesn't work. I mean, I imagine for an actor who's going to be animated over, that's a weird situation to be put in, because you know, all right, they're not using my voice. I'm going to be animated over to some extent. What do I even do here that gives them something they can use? Like, what can I do? And so a lot of them act like me in high school, and everything is all like hands and pointing and pirouetting and tons of physical nothingness in an attempt to put something across on the screen. I like the style, but a lot of the time it doesn't really work. Like Mitchell said, the backgrounds are beautiful. That sounds like such a backhanded compliment to the film. And it's also something I say about Cool World is the backgrounds are beautiful, but what happens in front of them a lot of the time isn't. Since we all mentioned the pace, I do want to talk about how this kind of adapts the story and timeline of the novels. It's very start-stoppy. It's very kind of rushed in places. Were there any scenes where you guys felt like it slowed down for a second and worked? Were there any moments where you thought, okay, that feels like a scene compared to the rest of what I've watched? Or contrastingly, if there weren't, are there any moments that really kind of crystallized for you, this is not working, I have no idea what just happened in the preceding scene?
I mean, I've got one of each. Like right off the bat is in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
after Bilbo's birthday party, the ring reveal happens, and then it does the 17 years later
yeah.
montage, which I love them including the time span that the Peter Jackson films don't. But the seasons montage in the like wide shot of the Shire, it's like that's a great way to really succinctly cover the fact that all of this time passes and not much happens. But it's it's a beautiful piece of art. It's a great way to edit it, and then you're in and you're out really quickly. Fantastic pacing. I think it really works. My scene that does not work is the like 4.5 minutes of the orcs running with Merry and Pippin, because it was just like we just keep getting another wide shot, wide shot, wide shot, tight shot, wide shot of just orcs running and nothing else is happening. And then it's like, oh no, Merry fell down and he gets trampled. And then we're back into another wide shot and nothing has changed. And it's like, this movie's 2 hours and 15 minutes long. We couldn't have cut 3 of these wide shots of rotoscoped orcs running.
I do like that extreme wide of them running across the plain, and you have the score in the background with the drums, and at first you're like, "Ooh, this is a good shot," and then it goes on like 3 times longer than.
And the shot where they're running through the plains, and then the riders of Rohan are like coming down on the 2 hills on the side of the frame. I was like, that's beautiful, fantastic. You should have just had that shot.
Yeah. I do think it's funny that they run everywhere. I know that happens in the books, but the montage of the Fellowship chasing the orcs with Merry and Pippin where it's just shots of them running, and at no point do they have a horse or anything. It's just they sprinted across Middle Earth. There's a shot in there where Aragorn trips and nobody acknowledges it. He just falls on his face. Yeah, there are bits in this that are very unintentionally funny, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think my favorite portions are that opening prologue, which is sort of silhouetted against the red. I think that's really striking and does a great job of sort of setting up the whole conflict. I keep going back to the source material. So a lot of what I like are lines that are taken directly from the book, and which were also used as they are in the book in Peter Jackson's films, like Bilbo's speech. I know less than half of you half as well as I should, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve, or whatever it is. And Frodo's moments, like I will take the ring to Mordor, but I do not know the way. Those lines tend to sort of crystallize everything in moments of confusion. I think in terms of the animation, I liked the scene when Frodo is. It's a little awkward because it's like he's running away from the Nazgul to get to Rivendell so he doesn't die from this poison stab wound. And there's a weird stretch there where he's kind of like standing or sitting on the pony or the horse or whatever. And it's like he should be going as fast as he can, but he's kind of just like standing there for a minute. But then I do like when the way that they visually realize the lake or the river sort of engulfing the Nazgul and becoming its like the horses or the water becoming its own band of horses. I guess that was a cool moment.
And that was Gandalf's idea. I remember that from the movie. All right. Christian stole my scene. I promise. I swear. That was my idea. That was going to be the one I mentioned. I just feel like in general, any scene where they're introducing characters for the first time, even if it's not in a state of conflict, if it's just like Legolas being introduced, like that's a very like effectual moment. I think anytime there's like a first attempt at something, it feels very daring, but then it goes on for too long, or then it's like, well, yeah, that's probably the only criticism. It just goes on for too long, and I just think the character progression, like there's just no momentum. And I just feel like the having those janky animated moments definitely does not help solidify how much you would normally care about these characters. And it definitely feels like there's something missing. So, yeah, every time there's an introduction or even like the grand scale battle towards the end, like that introduction felt great. Then it goes on for too long, but it felt very, like I was totally invested in it. And it's just like, it's an abusive relationship. I have to say it's an abusive relationship. I think, but you know, it's self-contained moments, and you know they're really great. They're really like if you saw a clip of it on YouTube and it's like, oh, I've never seen this before. This would be really cool to watch, and then you actually watch it, and it's like I'm never watching that again. Yeah, the one time I would recommend where having like 1 minute shorts of something is better than having an entire movie.
Oh no, go ahead, Connor.
I was kind of jumping off what Mitchell had mentioned about the Gandalf white horses in the water thing. I really love how they did the characterization in this, where it felt like they were just really well done. I mean, whether it's Sam, whose like only line is, "Well, I'm gonna do what Mr. Frodo does," in like 4 scenes. But the Gandalf not just being some like wise old wizard guy, where he's like, I did those white horses in the water. Wasn't that cool? Or when he like punks Sam in the Shire, when he like turns around and does the hands at him and he goes, ah, like, you know, just stuff like that. Or the fact that Boromir felt more like a 3-dimensional character in this than I expected, even though he has dialogue in like 3 scenes. But he still comes across as a character with depth. And I think a big part of that is, you know, looping back to the theatricality of the performance, is that you have these really hardcore, like a lot of stage actors with experience in like literally like Shakespeare in England. And I think they can bring an incredible amount of depth, even with just a voice performance, to these characters in very short amounts of time. And I think that's something that is missing from a lot of like modern films.
Yeah, a lot of the voice acting is really good. John Hurt plays Aragorn. That's a performance everybody talks about from this film. Anthony Daniels is Legolas, which is a very weirdly animated character. I don't like what they do with his
Yes.
face most of the time, but the vocal performance is still good.
No, it's a hair color change away from being racist.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
yeah.
I was going to mention Boromir as well because I think my favorite scene of the whole movie is his death scene. Because that I think really encapsulates for me kind of the message of Boromir's character in a way that I don't think has ever really been put across as clearly before. Because Boromir is kind of what the world of men thinks is like the ideal candidate for the ring. He's this great warrior. He's strong. He's victorious in battle. But it requires more than that to carry the burden of the ring. And I think that's represented here so succinctly and really well. And despite his flaws, his death scene still has kind of some triumph to it. In, you know, he lets out that huge scream after he's been pierced with like 18 arrows that even though he's clearly dying, all the orcs are like, all right, but do we need to step back for a second? And I think that's a great encapsulation of his character that even the Jackson film, I don't think quite hits on as well, at least for me. In terms of scenes that don't work, and this is kind of an animation thing as well. The first part of the sequence at the Prancing Pony, where Frodo gets up on the table and does his dance, I think everything at the Prancing Pony is not good, and that comes down to pacing partially, where you feel like we should be focusing on the song, but we're constantly cutting in and out of it, and additionally, the some of the animation in this movie isn't actually animation because they were on a really quick schedule. So more than maybe any other Ralph Bakshi movie, a lot of this is very experimental because the cinematographer or the animators would go, you know, Ralph, we could maybe do this to cut down on time and it might look kind of cool. And he'd go, oh, show it to me, to coin a phrase. And so a lot of the animation in this is actually solarization of stuff they shot in live action, which is a complicated process. You could probably explain better than I could, Connor. But basically, you expose the film in a way where it kind of looks sort of flat and two-dimensional, and there's this really hard black border around high contrast areas that Bakshi went, yeah, that kind of looks like animation. And it really works for the Nazgul and the orcs, I think. But for the people in the Prancing Pony, it looks horrifying. And I think that first section of the Prancing Pony is meant to be kind of like, it's meant to be pleasant, and it's meant to kind of almost provide a contrast of like, oh, isn't it kind of humble, this place that this journey has started out on? Nothing all that wrong has happened yet, and they're at this pleasant place, and they're singing and dancing, and everybody's having fun, and it just looks like a nightmare. And really doesn't work. But that's probably a good transition to talk about the animation a little bit more. There's tons of different techniques in this. It's very mixed media. What worked for you and what didn't? I mean, did anything work especially well? It sounds like a lot of it's pretty scattershot for you guys.
I like the Nazgul for the most part, though I didn't like when inconsistencies showed up with them. Maybe this is less of an animation point, but it seemed like the way in which their travel was illustrated, it seemed like it suggested at one point that several of them like teleported into the rooms at the Prancing Pony that the hobbits were sleeping in. And that was just kind of strange to me because I feel like that conjures a lot of plot holes or just general confusion. But I really liked at least the first appearance of the Nazgul being this like shapeless black thing. It reminded me of going back to Pinocchio again, the coachman's minions who are in like one shot, but they're just like this black silhouette with red eyes and nothing else.
Yeah.
And then they take other forms, I guess, as Frodo puts on the ring. I guess I like that first form the most, but similarly, the orcs I think are well realized. I think maybe the silver lining of some of the Merry and Pippin running around stuff is you see more of the detail. And maybe this would be an example of animation that isn't really animation, because I feel like a lot of these, at least shots where you get a closer look at the orcs, it just looks like makeup and costume rather than a drawing. But I think the way that the dark forces are literally dark for most of the film leaves an impression.
The orcs and the Nazgul are almost entirely solarization, and they did a different process where they would like literally Xerox the film frames and then colorize them in post, which I do think is neat because that provides like a very clear contrast between these are kind of our otherworldly, off-putting villains, and then these are our leads, and it creates a clear contrast in battle scenes, I think.
And see, I'd almost agree with that, except for the fact that they do the same process to the Rohirrim. Like all of the riders of Rohan are these real people with bleach blonde animated hair.
Yeah.
And yeah, that feels a little funky to me.
It's one of those things that works till it doesn't. This movie is full of those.
Which is something that I think works very well every time, despite like kind of the variety of techniques they use, is how they depict magic. Like both Saruman and Gandalf casting magic, and then it being this combination of like lens flares or these, super bright neon scribbles across the frame where I'm like, that feels very of the world, but it's also clearly more than the rest of the characters can do, in a way that I thought was really just visually effective. Like in the first scene with Saruman, when he like does his "I am Saruman of many colors" and a bunch of lens flares just start like shooting across the frame, you're like, this is sick as hell. Yeah.
J.J. Abrams is like, I will implement this. This will work for me.
I am J.J. Abrams of many colors.
Yeah.
And then he sticks Gandalf on top of the tower.
Yeah.
That's a great transition where then he's like totally surrounded by the magic. That is a great moment.
Yeah. Saruman's totally nice, normal-looking tower that gets shown in that establishing shot of Gandalf riding up. He's like, my friend Saruman in the world's worst place.
He's been doing some redecoration. He got really into spikes lately.
I think something we might not have mentioned was like the close-ups, because I kind of had to get used to the flowy animation. Like, why does it even look like this? Was my first reaction. But definitely got used to it very quickly, and I definitely think being over emotive rather than under emotive is a really great strategy when it comes to early animation like this. And I think it was very easy for me to believe that these are individual characters with their own motivations and backgrounds. And Connor mentioned Gandalf. Like, I feel like every time he emotes, it's like he's a very dynamic character. Like he has so many different facets to him, and he's so interesting, and he makes you want to learn more about him. And I don't think there's too many other characters besides ones we already kind of touched on. I feel like most of the other characters are very backgroundy, and sometimes they're quite literally backgroundy. But if they're given their moments of fame, I think and especially when they have those close-ups, it really is like that does look like a person, even though they're a little wonky, their mouth is a little too big, or they're flailing around too much. I think it's definitely something really cool. That's what's gonna stick with me, like memory wise.
I do think you've hit on a good point there, Mitchell, that faces are a consistent weakness in this. Faces and eyes, because half the time you look at Gandalf and it looks like he took something bad a couple hours ago when you look at his eyes and like half the size of his face. I do like that Gandalf is kind of scary in this. He's kind of this like wily old kook, which I do think is deliberate sometimes, because Connor, you mentioned like when he like fakes out Sam, but sometimes I don't think it's intentional. Sometimes I think it's just the eyes are difficult to handle in the rotoscoping, and there's other shots that just they feel way too tight on people's faces. There's that moment in where Bilbo sees the ring again, and in the Jackson film, that's a great moment. A lot of people remember where he reaches for the ring suddenly and almost has like a Gollum-like face. And in this, he like turns into an Adam Sandler character for a second in an extreme close-up, and he's waving his hands around and doing these weird facial expressions, and it doesn't really work. I mean, I am more fond of the animation than I am not fond of it. Even the stuff that isn't animation, because like you said, Christian, this is so different to anything else that you would see nowadays and kind of even back then. Like animation, I think, has very much been standardized by the big successful companies at this point. You know, if you're going to see a film, it's usually going to be Disney has their style and DreamWorks has their usual style, and Illumination, I spit upon their name, has their usual style. And
Minecraft.
they might have vague variations on that, but it's very much the same. And I don't think there's anything else that looks like this, even at the time that it was made. And that doesn't necessarily make it good, but I think it can make it interesting. And I'm happy to be interested at the very least.
I think another good moment in terms of the drawing is the monster outside of the Mines of Moria. And I particularly like the moment where the tentacles sort of like reach in and shut the doors on them after they escape into the mines. I think that's done maybe better than Jackson's film because the CG they used is not really up to date yet.
There are a few moments that are more traditionally animated. They didn't have like a, you know, you don't have a giant squid octopus mine creature to rotoscope. So they traditionally animate that, and they Treebeard, when he eventually shows up for a couple scenes, is a traditionally animated character. And those are maybe the most fluid bits of animation in the film, but they kind of feel weird in the movie. They feel out of place because they are so kind of traditional for an animated film compared to the reality of everything else. They don't quite pass as well. Something like the Balrog, maybe they should have animated like that instead of what they did do. But so that was kind of a weird
the Balrog
choice.
And his big feet. It's just so funky to me. Like big head, big feet,
His
little
disco
body.
platform shoes, yeah.
The flashbacks when Gandalf the White first appears, and then he tells them what happened with the Balrog, and we flash back and we actually see this like utterly majestic painting of him fighting this huge Balrog. I'm like, it
He
did
shows
not
them
look
his
like
art
that
calendar.
30 minutes ago.
This is what it looked like.
Yeah, Nat, I mean, I'm going to bring up Cool World again, where I think what works so well for me about Cool World is the same style of backdrops that are so, like, stylistic and almost, like, gothic with the traditional animation on top of them. And so I would have loved to see that with, like, the orcs. I think it would have made the action scenes a lot more convincing, where it's really funky seeing actors that are clearly like live action actors pretending to be cut up by Aragorn, and then because of that, their reactions don't line up and the pacing's off, and you're just going like, what are we doing here, guys? So, but I wanted to loop it back to the close-ups thing, because I think part of the reason why they're so jarring is that there's essentially no medium shots in this film. Like everything is either a full body wide or it is a like head and neck close up.
Yeah, that is a good point.
For most of it. And I think the close-ups would be a lot more effective if we got medium shots to kind of mix up the compositions. Because you go from like you're seeing a stage, essentially, note air quotes, to we've punched in like 6 inches off of the character, and they're yelling in our face.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think some of the stuff that's pseudo animation, the solarized and Xerox stuff, specifically the stuff at Helm's Deep, that's maybe a time constraint thing, where because of the schedule they had on this, like I said, they weren't really shooting for live action or animation. And Helm's Deep, they went out to Spain and they shot a bunch of stuff with extras. And Bakshi was directing. But the day they were doing or not Mines of Moria, the Helm's Deep stuff, the day they were doing that, Ralphie gets all his extras in place. And it took so long that by the time they had everybody in place, they had to call lunch. And Bakshi hadn't gotten to film anything yet. So for the sake of the schedule and not going on meal penalty, a lot of the shots of orcs walking towards Helm's Deep in the movie are literally just shots of the extras walking to lunch. Because that's the angle he had to shoot it. And so you get people that are like 2 inches from the camera. You get people like, it's not really framed, but they're walking to craft services. I need to shoot them walking. So let's shoot it. We don't have any time. And there's a lot of stuff like that in the movie, I think, where it's just go, 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 go. We don't have time to fix this. I don't know if you guys recognize this. Saruman is referred to as both Saruman and Ahriman throughout the film.
Yeah.
Because Saul Zaentz, who produced this, said during pre-production, Saruman and Sauron sound too similar. We should call Saruman Ahriman. So they changed it, but then they did a script rewrite in the middle of the movie, and the screenwriter thought, that's stupid. I'm going to change that back. But they had already recorded a lot of the lines. So they didn't have time to re-record.
Oh,
so
no.
He's just both of them. He's Ahriman and he's Saruman. And I think that's a great representation of just... they're laying the track as the train is running here, and eventually they crashed into the box office.
It was really interesting. After watching the film, I did some Wikipedia reading, and here, like, I think after reading that, the weird pacing makes a lot more sense when you're like, originally this was going to be one of 3 films, and then they said, no, you have to make it 1 film. We're not going to give you budget to make a second. And then he pushed back and was like, no, we have to do 2 films. And so all of the scenes are like setting up a different length of series. And I think that's a big reason why it's so start-stoppy, because there was no clear end point during production. They're just like, we're going to take this as far as we can, and we're just going to make some scenes and put them together. And then we'll have, a 2-hour movie at the end of it.
Yeah. I think that's most evident in Merry and Pippin. There's like everything with Treebeard doesn't really need to be there because he doesn't surface. They don't show any like end conflict at Orthanc or any of that stuff. And there's even a shot of Merry and Pippin, a couple shots of them when they first wander into Fangorn Forest, and both of their hair suddenly turns like very dark brown to black. And then like 2 scenes later, it's back to the like orangish color it was before. So there are a lot of like miscellaneous threads and setups. It's almost comparable to like an end credits scene in a Marvel movie that doesn't get picked up in the sequel.
Yeah, I think this is all a very good transition to talk about the ending, because like you said, Connor, at some point they were under the impression we're going to get a second movie, and obviously they didn't. So this is The Lord of the Rings Part 1, not really. And they end this after the Battle of Helm's Deep and try to imply that it's the deciding victory in the conflict with Sauron, and they have really won. Now, as an adaptation, that clearly doesn't work. Does that work in any way at all as an ending to this movie, do you guys think? What's your impression on the ending?
Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
That's pretty apt, yeah.
They try to play it both ways, because there's that one line, like you're right, they do say that it's this decisive victory, and they imply that it constitutes the defeat of evil and Sauron. But then they also say the first tale of the Lord of the Rings, which implies that there's still more. So I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think it really works.
Well, the ending we probably all watched, which is the common ending now, is actually a re-release ending. The original ending to this movie, after the Helm's Deep battle, it fades to black, and then sans serif text in all caps pops up that says, "End of Part 1." And there's a narrator that says that in the background. And that was...
Wow.
And, they advertised this as... like The Lord of the Rings. There was no Part 1 because the studio said people aren't going to pay to see half of a story. But it just meant that everybody was angry because they went to see a full story. Yeah.
I will say, I don't think the ending works, not necessarily because like it can't work. The final climax is just not very climactic. Like the Helm's Deep fight.
Oh, okay.
When they like ride out to have their fight, it feels all cool, and you're like, hell yeah, guys, like go get those orcs, and you're just getting like individual shots of dudes killing orcs killing dudes. And then it cuts to the wide shot when they're surrounded, and you're like, oh, this is like 20 guys. And they're surrounded by like 2,000 orcs. And you're like, okay, I guess they're all gonna die. And then Gandalf shows up with another 10 guys and rides down the hill, and we're like, now we win. And so for me, it was just like, I don't believe this. Like, your 30 dudes on horses aren't gonna defeat thousands of orcs in any meaningful way. But I guess we're just expected to believe that the orcs routed and they all die and Saruman gives up. Like, it just fell flat for me.
Yeah, that's very fair. You bringing up Gandalf also reminds me that something that one of many things that Jackson films do better, but I think they really realized the transition from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White better, because his physicality is different when he becomes Gandalf the White. He acts differently. There's more regality about him. In this film, he's basically the same character. He moves exactly the same. Like, he doesn't have any additional dignity. He's just got some new threads.
Even the costume is the same except for the color, because he's still got the white hat.
Yeah. And like, he also, that ending charge is so awkward. Like, he's doing this weird thing with his sword where he's like waving it around in the air like it's a baton. Yeah, awkward is a good word for a lot of what happens in this movie.
Not to say that the individual action scenes aren't kind of cool. Like the dudes killing the orcs, that's cool on its own. But yeah, I totally agree, Connor. Like, man, that was goofy. That was goofy.
And it really was disappointing following the like initial Helm's Deep siege scene, because I thought that was really cool.
That
with
stuff
like
was
them
really
on
cool,
the
yeah.
ramparts and the just arrows blacking out the sky, and then Saruman's magic blowing up the walls. I was like, this is hype.
Yeah.
And then, you know, the King Theoden being like, I will not die in this cave. I'm a man of Rohan. I'll die on my horse. And he wants to ride out. I'm like, this is so cool. And then, yeah, you get let down by the end. And it was sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do like how violent this is. That's
Yes.
a fair thing to bring up. There's a lot of blood. There's a lot of screaming orcs and men falling over in battle. When somebody gets whacked, like, you can see they're really getting whacked. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily add up to a cohesive whole. And the ending, it feels what it is. It feels tacked on. It feels like, all right, well, I guess we ran out of track. Let's stop here and say it's where we meant to stop the whole time. Even though they still have the stuff with Treebeard, and the last we see of Frodo and Sam, who are the main characters of this story, is them walking off into a trap with Gollum that will never be resolved. Yeah, it's an interesting movie, and I like it, and I'm glad that we watched it for the show. But yeah, it's a mess. That kind of brings us to the end of my questions. But is there anything else you guys wanted to discuss or bring up about the film before we wrap up?
I think we should probably touch on the female characters and how Ralphie handles them, because I think that's another significant failure of his. I with the exception of Galadriel, I think the stuff in Lothlorien is pretty cool, and I feel like his the stylish backgrounds that we're talking about and all this sense that it's beautiful and terrifying, and even like Boromir's protest about them going there because he doesn't want to be charmed by a witch. I think all that's pretty cool. But Arwen is deleted from the film.
Yeah.
And despite this scene where Aragorn kind of gives this speech about a fable where an elf maiden chooses to die with her human lover, but then it feels like that's set up for Arwen, and then that just doesn't happen, maybe for the reasons we've discussed about all these deadlines. And Eowyn is also really poorly handled in Rohirrim. Yeah.
I want to jump in about that fable scene, because I don't think it's set up for Arwen. I think it's set up for Frodo and Sam's homosexual love. Because
Letterboxd.
when Aragorn is done with that story, we end the scene on a shot of like Frodo and Sam super close to each other, and then Sam like turns to Frodo and like touches his face, and they're like, "Aw."
Yeah, they are like lovingly looking into each other's eyes. I noticed that. Yeah.
Which, you know, I think if any film was going to give us the Frodo Samwise ship that we deserved, it was going to be the second Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, and we just didn't get it. I wanted them to kiss on Mount Doom when the ring goes into fire.
Now, that I don't think that's likely, but it is possible.
It's not likely.
Because one of Bakshi's consistent things is, especially his early stuff, because this was he made Wizards, which is kind of sci-fi, and then he made sci-fi fantasy, and then he made this. But most of his work before this is like social dramas about people in the streets, people in the New York from Brooklyn, in the neighborhood from Brooklyn, where he grew up. So a lot of his movies feature gay people, like lots of they feature prostitutes and drag queens, and they're very diverse and open about all these different groups of people in ways that you don't really see in movies, especially animated movies from the time. But like you touched on, Christian, a consistent weakness of Bakshi films is that a lot of the times these different groups, including women, are portrayed only to illustrate their persecution when they're immediately beaten up or killed by a cop or an abusive lover or something like that. Most of the time in a Ralph Bakshi film, an early one at least, if a woman shows up, she's going to have a nipple pop out or her clothes are going to disappear or something. Sometimes for comedy, sometimes for a lame, like, social point they're trying to make. And I think he had the presence of mind to know he couldn't do that with Lord of the Rings, but that kind of left him like, well, what else do you do with a lady? All right, never mind. And they don't really use them as a result.
It is interesting how, like, 'cause I did really like the characterization of Galadriel. Like, I've talked about how I like how they do characters in this, but she was still drawn and animated like Hollywood to a certain level. For those who don't know, from Cool World, like the Marilyn Monroe kind of stand-in.
Nobody knows anything about Cool World. I can't believe we're using it as this much of a touch point for this episode.
But it is like for like they're always drawn like skinny. They move in like a kind of sultry way, and then there's always a little bit of exposed cleavage. And it's that you don't need that for Galadriel, but it's still there. And I do think that is just one of Ralphie's shortcomings, is that, like, there is going to be diversity in his films, but it's not going to be like acceptable by today's standards, and it's arguable whether it was acceptable by the standards of that time period as well.
I'm behind the gay angle. I endorse that.
Cookie
They'll have to adopt. They'll have to adopt to continue the Baggins line.
I think I would have gotten behind it if the distinguishing feature for Sam next to all the other hobbits is just giving him this like ugly troll face. Why did they do that?
I made a joke when I was watching it with Sam where it's just everything that comes up, Sam's like, I'm gonna go where Mr. Frodo goes. And I was thinking about, like, if the Fellowship are just friends, they're like, what do you guys want to get for dinner tonight? And Sam's like, I want to go where Mr. Frodo goes.
I do think so. For the longest time, the only thing I had seen of Sam in this film was probably his worst moment in the entire movie, where Frodo tells him, we're going to go see the elves. And he goes, oh, hooray! And runs away. And so I thought that's how he was throughout the whole movie. He's not quite that, like, because based on that alone and like screen grabs, you would think that Sam in this film is just a total doofus. And his whole point is to have like dooty dooty music play over him as he trips over himself on the trail. There is more to him than that. And I do kind of think I see where Ralph Bakshi thought they could go with this, where at the end, it's the buffoon, the character you least expected that displays his bravery the most and helps Frodo the most. I do think that could work. I don't think it works the way that Jackson's Sam works, where he's an honorable guy from the beginning, but he's reluctant to leave home and take risks. And he's not a doofus. He's just kind of a guy who's never left his home before. But I can see it working here. It would be like, people talk about like the Muppet fan cast, Lord of the Rings, and when they cast Fozzie as Sam, this is the kind of Sam they're thinking of. I think that kind of resolution for Fozzie Sam is what you would have gotten for this Sam if they'd made it to Mordor.
Also, this characterization of Sam, I think, makes the turn a lot more impactful when they start interacting with Gollum, and Sam's like, torture him, kill him. it's that much more like shocking and brutal because he's just kind of like a happy-go-lucky guy.
Alrighty. Well, are we ready to move on from our discussion of Lord of the Rings to the rundown then?
And try to run, Zach. Try to run.
Run all the way to Moria. Yep. Let's stop at Tom Bombadil's.
Oh yeah, another unfortunate cut. I was kind of hoping they would do this here because Jackson doesn't do Bombadil either. But
No,
alas.
nobody does
Well, and
Bombadil.
I love the inclusion of songs. Sorry to take it
Oh,
back
yeah.
to talk about the movie, but the songs were fantastic. Yeah.
I
No,
do.
I agree.
I love the song that the orcs sing during the march on Helm's Deep, because it's got the heavy drums, and they mention the drums in Moria, which is something that I don't think really comes back that prevalently in other versions of Lord of the Rings. But here you get that setup, you get that payoff, and it really adds to the atmosphere of the orcs marching on the keep, and the animation there. Animation and pseudo animation really works as well, like with the red and the smoke. It looks like a visual out of Dante's Inferno or something. That's somewhere every aspect of the film really works together well.
Yeah. I love the song they sing in mourning for Gandalf after the
Yes.
Balrog scene.
Yeah.
That one is beautiful. I gotta add that to my library somehow. Okay. We've got a list of things here that we're gonna read to Zach, and we're gonna go Mitchell, Connor, Christian. Mitchell, Connor, Christian. Rinse and repeat. So we've got 1 minute. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, go.
Choking at your friend on your birthday.
2 out of 5.
Rotoscoping.
4 out of 5.
Saruman the Red.
3 out of 5.
I want my MTV.
2 out of 5.
John Hurt as Aragorn.
4 out of 5.
Troll-faced Samwise Gamgee.
2 out of 5.
Sniff of air.
3 out of 5.
Leonard Rosenman's score.
3 out of 5.
Stanky-legged Nazgul.
4 out of 5.
Looking foul and feeling fair.
3 out of 5.
C-3PO as Legolas.
3 out of 5.
Song and dance portions.
3 out of 5.
Poisoned icicle.
3 out of 5.
The Pointing Attack.
4 out of 5.
Silhouetted prologue.
4 out of 5.
Bill the pony sacrifice.
4 out of 5.
Not seeking power, but the strength to defend oneself.
3 out of 5.
Arwen deletion.
2 out of 5.
Not being able to run.
3 out of 5.
A Fear of Lakes.
3 out of 5.
Throwing what's you're out of time.
Okay.
That was a long one.
You'll never know who's throwing or what.
That was a pretty good rundown. We got some good terms in there.
Yeah. It was
yeah.
hard to write it without just referencing Lord of the Rings as opposed to Bakshi's Lord of the Rings.
Can I put one more rundown in? Because it's a point I never got to bring up.
Yes.
Yes.
Aragorn's slutty little skirt and boots.
5 out of 5. It's the best part of the movie. You referring to Sam as troll faced though, Christian, did remind me of in the Moria sequence. There's so many things like this in the movie where they talk about it and it results in nothing, but they have a cave troll, and then the troll just kind of sticks his arm through the door, and then Gandalf shuts it. It doesn't result in anything. There's so much stuff like that in this movie. But I think we had a fun discussion about it. Connor, thank you for being here. Is there anything you'd like to plug while you're here, or mention, or bring up?
Yeah, no. I hope to be back again. I always have a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was a blast. Thank you for being here, Connor. This is kind of an unusual episode in that we have nothing to preview next time, because our next episode will be our season wrap-up. So if you'd like to see us just gab about the 18 films we talked about this season, chat about our favorite moments, which we didn't like, what might be next for the show, then tune in next time. Until then, we have been Cookie Pocket. Good night.